All right, we'll get started in just another minute here, just waiting to see if anybody else is going to join. If you could, please let me know in the comments in the chat there if you can hear me okay and if you can see the screen all right, just so I know we're looking good before we get started. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So let's go full screen here. So welcome and thanks for joining me today. This is going to be an introduction to building REST applications with Spring Boot. I know that there's only so much we can do in an hour, but I think we'll have some good information in here and kind of get you interested in building apps with Spring Boot and specifically REST applications. This is my first webinar on Google Hangouts, so please give me some slack on that. I apologize in advance for any issues we come across. I have some plans for doing this type of lunch and learn broadcasts, maybe one time a month or maybe even more. But I want to try this out first and just see how it goes, and we'll go from there. Save any questions you have for the end, please. I don't have another screen where I can see what questions are being asked, so I apologize if I don't get to those questions. We will have a few minutes at the end to hopefully answer some questions. And also, if you stick around to the end, I know you're probably multitasking here at lunch. Either eating some lunch or reading up on some news or doing whatever. I understand that. Stick around to the end. I have a little something to give away. So I just want to talk a little bit about me. My name is Dan Vega, and this is a picture that I actually took from my balcony. I live here in Lakewood, right next to Cleveland, Ohio, and that's a shot of downtown Cleveland. And I absolutely love our view here. It's just amazing. So a little bit about me. I'm a huge Cleveland sports fan, so most of the time I'm pretty miserable, except for right now, to be honest. This is probably one of the better times we've had in a while. We got the Cavs in the Eastern Conference Finals. We got the Indians playing well, so things are looking good on that front for once. I'm a software developer. I work for an insurance company, and for the last few years, we've had some really cool projects that we've worked on. Say for the last 3 years or so, we've been mainly a Groovy and Grails shop. I absolutely love Groovy. I love working with it. It's a great language. We still do a lot of Java stuff, but mainly been working in Groovy and Grails, and that's pretty much been the last 3 years. And I've worked on some really cool projects, and I work with a really great team, so that's always awesome. I'm big into teaching, and that's kind of why I'm doing this webinar today. I love teaching. I love helping others. I got into that really when I started blogging. I love blogging because I get to teach people and I get to learn. And when you got to tell somebody else how to do something, you better know how to do it yourself. So it's a great way to not only learn yourself, but to help others at the same time. And I kind of rolled that into YouTubing. I have a YouTube channel. You can find it on my website. And I just have a bunch of screencasts there on a variety of different topics, mainly programming stuff. And I recently became a teacher. I teach an online course on Udemy on Spring Boot, and that's kind of where this webinar came from. So I really love teaching and helping others. I've recently got into photography and videography. When I started teaching this online class, I really had to learn a lot about videography and editing and cameras and things like that. And I just really got interested in it, so I kind of stuck with it. I'm big into weightlifting. Gives me a way to get out of the house and go do something fun. Me and the girlfriend love to travel. I've been to some cool places lately. We were just in Miami last month, and that was a lot of fun. And if you need to find anything on me, therealdanvega.com is the URL. And you can find links to everything like my YouTube channel, my online courses, GitHub, where all my code is. If you look up there now, actually, there's a Spring Boot REST repo up there, so you can grab all the source code for what we're going to walk through today. So that's a little bit about me. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. So I don't have a ton of slides. We're going to go through just a few slides here just to kind of intro everything. And what I really want to do is jump into a big demo application. We're just going to start from scratch. We're going to create a to-do app, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So a few things that we're going to go through real quick. What is the Spring Framework? We'll get into that. We're going to spend one slide on that, and that's all. I know we don't want a huge history on the Spring Framework. And then because of learning what the Spring Framework is, then we can talk about what Spring Boot is and what does that bring to the table. Where does that really help us out? Just a quick intro to setting up your development environment. What would you need to get started doing this kind of work? We'll write a quick hello world from scratch. Actually, I think I already have that, the one single file written, but we'll show you how to do that without an IDE, so you don't need anything to get going. You could just write a quick Groovy file, a quick Java file, and use a Spring CLI to get that started. And then, like I said, we're going to build a to-do application. It's going to be a pretty basic app, but we're going to see a lot of the different components that our applications today need. Things like databases and JPA and REST endpoints, configuration stuff. So there's going to be a lot of the traditional components that go into building our REST applications, but this is going to be a pretty basic one, but I think we'll learn a lot from just looking at this app. So really quick, what is the Spring Framework? So the Spring Framework was created in 2002, and I think it was released in 2003 by Rod Johnson. It's free and open source. It really started as an inversion of control container, so it does a lot of dependency injection, and that's kind of where the core of the framework was built around. One of the great things about Spring Boot for me, though, is you don't need to know a lot of this stuff. You don't need to know what the Spring Framework is really to get started with Spring Boot. But it is good to get an idea of what Spring Framework is, because when we go into building these applications, we're still using the Spring Framework, and we need to know where to find answers to this kind of stuff. And Spring Framework really kind of gives us a bunch of different modules that help us build applications. So these are things that every single application that we build, we're going to need. We won't need every single one, but these are things that we may need, like dependency injection. An example of that today. AOP. Data, it comes with a lot of really nice data features, and especially when we get into the Spring world, in the Spring project world, there's things like Spring Data, which gives us some really, really great features and some really easy way to kind of access data. There's Spring Security for securing your applications. There's Web MVC, which we're going to get into today, building a basic web app with Spring. REST is part of that MVC, the web stuff, so we're going to look at REST today, and so much more. So that's kind of the underline is the Spring framework and what that brings to the table. So what is Spring Boot then? So Spring Boot is basically the Spring framework minus the configuration. So one of the really hard things with building Spring applications, it's gotten a lot easier these days, but it's still a little bit confusing. And that is building a Spring application from start is a lot of configuration. You need to know what goes into a Spring application. There are different XML files that you need to set up, and if you don't know how to generate those or find an example of one, it can be kind of confusing. There's a lot of plumbing that goes involved to stand up a Spring application. So Boot is the Spring framework minus all of that configuration. It takes away all of that for you and provides some sensible defaults. And then something else you don't have to do is when you stand up a Spring app framework application, you need a server, right? You need something like Tomcat to deploy this application to you. Well, in Spring Boot, we get an integrated server, and by default, that is Tomcat, and you can switch that out if you need to something else like Jetty. But now we get this server too, and that's really what Spring Boot is. We get the power of Spring framework minus all of the configuration hassles, plus an integrated server, and just a whole bunch of really cool features, and that gives us Spring Boot. So, what are some of what are the primary goals of Spring Boot? So there's really three primary goals for Spring Boot, and this was kind of laid out by one of the developers, Phil Webb, and it kind of went into what are the goals for Spring Boot. And so the first one was get it started, to provide a radically faster and widely accessible getting started experience for all Spring development. And this is what I said before. We want an easy way to stand up an application. We don't want to spend 2 days working on like configuration issues and trying to understand all of the pieces and parts. Like, we know that we want to build a web app with REST endpoints, and we want to go ahead and stand it up now, and that Spring Boot really helps us do that. So opinionated, to be opinionated out of the box, but to get out of the way quickly as requirements start to diverge from the defaults. So basically, Spring Boot is going to have an opinion on what most applications look like. Most applications in the web world have a integrated, need a server, and we're going to provide you Tomcat by default. But if you need to change that, then it's not going to not allow that. It's going to allow you to go ahead and change that to Jetty. And there's just a lot of sensible defaults that Spring Boot is providing you just to get you up and running. And again, you can always change these things later. And then to provide a range of non-functional features that are common to a large classes of projects. So in most projects, you need an embedded server or security, metrics, and health checks, which we're going to see today as part of the actuator starter, and then externalized configuration. So it's just giving you a bunch of features right out of the box. And Josh Long, who's the developer advocate for Spring Boot, had a really good quote, and he said, Spring Boot lets you pair program with the Spring team, which is really cool because you get the power of kind of working with the Spring team. They've been through a lot of projects. They've worked with a ton of customers. They know what is common here. And so they're kind of providing us these common features to most projects. And then when we need to change something, we go ahead and change something. So let's talk about the to-do application. And this is the application that we're going to walk through today and just kind of build out from scratch and how we're going to build it out. So the first thing I want to do is just kind of look at the landscape of some Spring projects. We'll head over to that website, look at all the projects, look at where you can find information about these projects, and then we'll look at documentation. Where can we find, where can we find answers when we need them? To me, that's very important. You need to be able to get started with something, and I hope this webinar helps, but you're going to have questions and you're going to need answers. And where do you find those at? We're going to create a new project. So we'll create a brand new project from start. We'll use IntelliJ. You can use Spring Tool Suite or whatever other editor or IDE you like, but I'm going to use IntelliJ today. We're going to create a hello world. So we're going to actually use the Spring CLI for a minute before we jump into IntelliJ, but we're going to use the Spring CLI and kind of create just a hello world from there. We're going to build a to-do application and talk about it. So, you know, what goes into building this application, creating the controller, creating the service, creating a Spring repository to access data. We're going to go through each of these things and talk about them. And we're also going to talk about setting up your development environment. Just a quick, what do you need and how can we get started? So I think that's it. Let's go ahead and jump out of here. And yep, that's it. So let's go ahead and minimize this. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this up. So just let's talk about our development environment here. So what do we need to get started? Well, obviously we need Java. So if we go Java space version, we can see that Java is running 1.8. I believe you can get away with 1.6 still. I'd have to double check on that. I think the newest version is going to require 1.7. But I don't see a reason not to be on 8. So I would just go ahead and make sure Java 8 is installed. You need Maven or Gradle. We need a build tool here. So Maven V, you can see that I'm running Apache Maven 3.3. Don't worry about this. If you don't have Maven installed, you can actually install it using something I'm going to show you here in a second. So don't just pause this and run out and install that right away. What else do we need? We need something to build this in, right? I'm going to use IntelliJ today. You can use STS if you want. That's the tool by Pivotal called Spring Tool Suite. And then we need the Spring CLI if we want to do a couple of the things that I want to show you really quick. And so this is a good opportunity to talk about one of my favorite tools. Let me actually just pull up a website here. SDK, man. All right, so this is SDK Man, and it is the Software Development Kit Manager. And it's basically a tool for managing parallel versions of multiple software development kits. And so I use this on Mac. You can use it on Linux as well. There is a way to use this on Windows using PowerShell or Cygwin. I've always had a little bit of trouble using it on Windows. Thankfully, I haven't been on Windows for a little while now, so I haven't had to. But I believe it does still work. And this is for managing not just Java-related projects, but things like Groovy, Scala, Grails, Play, and even Spring Boot. And one of the things I like here is it says JDKs coming soon. Man, that would be really nice to be able to manage JDKs using SDK Man. So you'll find some information about how to get started with SDK Man, but I'm just going to show you real quick. So if you type in SDK once you have it installed, it's going to give you some info. And so here we can do things like install specific versions of different software. We can uninstall. We can list candidates. We can change like what version we're going to be using. So if we had to like test out a bug on like a specific version of Groovy, we can run back to that version. And there's no need to, the opposite of having to do it here is then you got to go like download a, let's say like a zip file. You put, this file somewhere in your path, and then you go change the environment variables to point to that specific version. So here we can do this all just from the command line, which is really nice. So I'm actually going to go SDK list, and this is actually going to show us a list of candidates that we are able to install from SDK Man. And so if you start to scroll down, you'll see things like Gradle, Grails, Groovy. There's just a bunch of really, what is the other one? There's Maven. And so there's just a bunch of really great candidates that we can use to install. So in this case, if we wanted to install Spring Boot, we can say we can find out which versions that we have. So if we go SDK list and then Spring Boot, this will tell us what versions we have. And you can see that I'm running on the 1.3.4 release, and actually 1.3.5 was just released. I think it was today or yesterday. So if we wanted to install that, we could. So the way that we do that is we just do an SDK install Spring Boot, which is the candidate, and then the actual version. So we can say 1.3.5.release. And so that will go ahead and download it and install it for us and make sure that this is the current one that we're using. So you see at the end of this, it'll ask, hey, do you want to make this your default? And we'll say yes. Now if we run that again, you'll see that we have two versions here. We have this one installed, so this asterisk means that it's installed, and then the caret is the one that we're currently using. So if we wanted to switch back to another version, we easily could. So that is that. And what that gives us is that what we just installed there is it actually gives us some things, and it gives us the Spring CLI, which allows us to do some things. So let's go ahead and clear out of that. And now what I want to do is take a look at that Spring CLI. So if we go Spring version, we should see that we're running the Spring CLI 1.3.5. So we can go ahead and use that. Let me see where we are. So I have this file here, app.groovy. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. Let me try and bump that up. Okay, so this isn't anything special here. This is just a Groovy file, and it's actually a full application. This will actually run for us. So all this is a class called Hello World. We've annotated it with REST controller. That's from the Spring framework, and this creates a REST controller for us. And then we create one method called home, and it has a request mapping of just /. So when we fire this up, if we go to localhost 8080, we should just get the words hello world returned back in JSON format. So this is our REST controller. And if we go ahead and close that out, we can go ahead and run this. So if we want to use the Spring CLI, we can say Spring run, and then whatever file or files we need to run. So I'm just going to run that one single file. And you're going to see it's going to fire up. It's going to run its, we'll talk about this actual output when we get into IntelliJ, but just know that it's given us some info and the application is up and running, and it's running at, by default, localhost 8080. So if we come back and we go here, we go to localhost 8080, there's our hello world. So that's pretty cool. That's one of the things the Spring CLI does. It allows us to run that. If I come into here, Control-C, we can actually shut that down. It's no longer running. So some things the Spring CLI also does, let's go ahead and just type in Spring. And you're going to see that it has all these available commands. So we can run. We just ran a particular app by passing in a Groovy script. We can test something. We can grab, which allows us to download Groovy script dependencies into a repository. We can jar, which we're going to do now. We're actually going to create a self-contained executable jar from our code. And then we can do a few other things. Init, we can actually use start.spring.io and initialize a new project if we wanted to. And so there's a few things this does, but let's go ahead and show this actually creating a jar. So I'm going to use that same app.groovy. We're just creating a very simple project here. And I'm going to say I want to create a hello world jar. And we're going to use app.groovy to create that. Oops, I forgot jar. So we need to say Spring jar is the command, hello world.jar is the jar, and app.groovy is the file that we're using to create that. So now if we go ahead and look at this, you'll see that we have a hello world.jar and a hello world.jar original. And the reason for the two is they're a little bit different. Let's go ahead and look at the contents of this. Oh, and actually I do want to just point this out real quick too. So we're using the Spring CLI here to create this executable jar. We can also use Maven or Gradle to create those as well. We're not going to look at an example of that today, but just know that once you get into a bigger project and you're in IntelliJ or you're in Spring Tool Suite and you have this humongous project, you don't need to use the Spring CLI. You could use Maven or Gradle to generate that as well. So let's take a look at the contents of these jars real quick. So if we go jar, let's clear this out, jar tf hello world.original. So you see there's not a lot of stuff in here. Basically, it just packages up what we needed to run. So this is just our stuff. But then if we look at jar, you're going to see all of this other stuff. So this is the full executable jar with all the dependencies included that we would need to go ahead and run. So now that we have our jar, we can run this just like any other jar. So we can say java-jar hello world.jar, and this is going to fire up our Spring application just like we did before by using the Spring run command. So again, it's going to do its thing. It started up in 7 seconds. If we go ahead and open up this and refresh, it's the same application. It's just in an executable jar format. So I think that is it with this. So that's the Spring CLI. That's what you get for installing Spring. Get a few nifty commands there. And that's pretty cool. So let's jump over to the Spring website real quick. I just want to look at a few things. So if you don't know, Spring is basically managed by Pivotal. Pivotal is the one behind Spring Framework, Spring Boot, Spring Data, all of these different projects. They're all managed by Pivotal. So if you come to the website, you can find a bunch of information about Pivotal. What I really like is there's a lot of really good information on this site as far as documentation and learning resources. You're never going to not be able to find information about all of these different projects, which I really love. So there's getting starting guides. You can go to guides here as well. And these guides are really just like 15 to 30-minute guides to do like a specific thing. So building a RESTful web service. If you want to build a RESTful web service, you can come into here and go ahead and get started. And that's kind of what we're going to do today. Maybe a little bit more than this, but these are great. So you can come in here, and if you want to find like one specific to REST, you can just start typing here, and it'll actually narrow that down to just things about REST. So that's pretty cool. And then from the documentation or from the docs, you can also go to start a new Spring project. And this is that website, start.spring.io, that allows you to kind of kickstart your Spring Boot project. Now, you can do this from here, or you can do it from inside of either IntelliJ or STS and really kick off your project. So you can do it here and download a zip, but we're actually going to do it in IntelliJ, so we'll come back. There's different tutorials, reference documentation. Then if we go over to projects, these are all the different projects under this Spring umbrella, if you will. So we have things like the Spring Framework. So when you want to find out information about Spring, say you're not quite sure what goes into, say, a REST controller, you can come in and look at the documentation. It'll tell you basically when you're on a specific version of Boot, you can figure out what version of Spring Framework it's using and jump in here and into the documentation. So there's great documentation on the Spring Framework that allows us to get answers to that real quickly. There's Spring Boot documentation, really good docs on getting going with Spring Boot in here. Spring Data, which we're going to look at today. If you need to get into like securing your applications, you can use Spring Security. So a whole bunch of projects in here that relate to the stuff that we're going to do, and I definitely recommend going through here, checking this out. And then the blog, there's a lot of good blog posts on here, and there's like a bunch of different authors that release info on here every day. So there's a lot going on in the Spring world, and this is kind of how I stay up to date on everything that's going on there. So that's the websites and the documentation, just in case you need to figure out how to get answers to something. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and create a new project. So let's go ahead and fire up IntelliJ. And I think I already have it open. All right, so we're going to create a new project here. We're going to use the Spring Initializer. I believe this is a, you have to have the complete edition for this. So I just got this, I just upgraded this for personal use. We use this at work a lot, obviously, and that's where I use it most of the time. But here on my personal laptop, I just got the 2016.1 release, and now you can start to like pay for this monthly. So I think it's like $10 a month or something, and I would definitely look into it because it's one of my favorite editors. It's great. It does everything you need. So we got this Spring Initializer here. We can create Spring Boot application using Spring Boot starters. So we're going to use Java 8. Here's our, again, the initializer service is that start.spring.io website that I just showed you. So we're using that under the hood. And what it's going to do is ask us for some information about our project. So let's call this our to-do app. I actually already have a to-do one, so I have to call this to-do app. And if you're on GitHub, you can actually find the code for this, and I'll link to that later on. So we have a to-do app. What type of project is it? We're just going to use Maven. I want to package this as a jar. You could always change it to war later if you change your mind or need to. And then we're going to use Java. I'm a big fan of Groovy, and if you haven't checked out Groovy, I would definitely check it out. But just for the sake of demo, we'll stay in Java here. So now I'm going to create a new group. And this is actually going to be the group and the package, the main default package. Usually these are the same, so I'm glad to see this change in IntelliJ. So it just kind of uses both of them. So I'm going to create a group called com.realdanvega. And we'll say for a description, just say to-do best app. All right, so all this stuff looks good. We're going to hit next. And I'm actually going to change this up to 1.4.milestone2. So this is the Spring Boot version that you're going to use. So first we decide what boot version we're using. The reason I chose 1.4 is because there's some really cool stuff coming in 1.4. We're not going to get into everything today, but I'll kind of mention a couple things. And there's some really great new testing support in 1.4. So if you've been using Spring Boot before and you haven't checked out 1.4, I definitely would check it out. So now we get to start to pick, like we're going shopping. All right, what kind of meal are we gonna make? So what kind of ingredients do we need to make this meal? So in our case, our meal is a REST application, and we need to figure out what ingredients we need out of the store, out of the grocery store here to make our meal. And these are nice aisles for us divided up. So we have this core aisle, and in the core aisle, ALP and security and caching. Lombok, I'm going to choose Lombok, and I'm going to talk about Lombok just for a few minutes when we get to it, but Lombok is a really cool project that can save us a ton of time. Web, this is definitely going to be a web project, so I need to select web. What else do we need? So we may try to get to this at the end using REST repositories with the HAL browser, but I'm not going to get there just yet. I want to create some REST class. I want to create a REST controller from scratch first. Spring Data REST and the REST repositories together really can cut down some development time, but I think it's good to learn how to build these first before we get into some of those time savers. From a SQL standpoint, we're going to use Spring Data JPA. And we're also going to use H2. So H2 is just an in-memory database. We're going to use it for just, storing a little bit of data. And if you want, obviously, if you were going to move to like a production environment, you would use something else like MySQL or something else. You have NoSQL options. Then you have a lot of information on cloud. So there's a lot of really great support for cloud storage, cloud configuration. There's just we could probably do a whole nother book, webinar series just on talking about all the cloud integrations that can happen. So we're not actually going to use any of those. Then we have like social, if you want to like hook into Facebook and LinkedIn or Twitter. We have IO, a really great starter if you're going to use mail. Just include this mail, you provide a few properties in your configuration file, and you're ready to go. The actuator I'm going to actually include because that'll give us some endpoints. and some pretty cool health metrics that we'll check out. So I think that's it. Again, all of these options are available on that start.spring.io website as well. This just gives it to you right here in the IDE. Oh, and actually, let me just show you this. So if you don't know where something is, you can just start to search for it here, and it'll kind of show you where it is. So that search feature is nice as well. So we're going to click Next. We're going to call this our To-Do app. This is where we're saving it. I actually don't need that. Dev boot To-Do app. Sounds good. So, all right. All right, so first let's look at the directory structure here. Just a cool little tip here. If you're in IntelliJ and you want to start to jump down the directory structure, if you hit the asterisk on your number key here, you can start to expand all of these out. So we have a traditional structure here. We have our Maven Palm file. We have source main, our source test. So source test is obviously where all of our test files are going to go. Source main is where both our Java files and our resources are going to go. So let's kind of jump in and look at the Maven Palm first. So this is kind of the information we filled out when we got started with the application. And here's our parent Palm, and this is kind of where some of the magic starts to happen. And we're basically feeding off of this parent Palm for some defaults. So if we click into there, we can start to see some defaults. And these are defaults that we're going to override. And this is kind of where it starts. We just start pulling information from the parent Palm. But now when we get into our dependencies here, you'll see, where's our web one? So when we checked that web box, it included something for us called the Spring Boot Starter Web. And one of the things that really comes into play when configuring Spring applications is managing dependencies. So, you know, to start a Spring web application, we probably need like, you know, Spring Web MVC. We probably want some Jackson to be able to translate our data into JSON. We probably need a server configured for us like Tomcat. We need validation. And then managing all of these different dependencies and getting the version numbers right that go with each other is really just a pain in the butt. So what this starter does for us is, if we jump into that, you'll see that we're getting included for us the Spring Boot Starter, Tomcat, Validator, data binding, Spring Web, and Spring Web MVC. So we no longer need to, we no longer need to like try to figure out how to manage all of these dependencies. So just by going through and checking all of those things in the initializer that our project is going to need, we kind of get all this stuff configured for us, which is really great. Now, this doesn't mean that if we didn't check something, you can't use it. Obviously, if you just come in and add a new dependency, it's going to work just fine. But that just kicked off for us what we needed to do. So let's do that and click OK. All right, so that's our Maven Palm file. So now if we go into the main Java and then our default package, so mine was com.thereal.vega. Here's our to-do application. And before we talk about anything, let's just go ahead and run this. So I like to always run this before we do anything. I just want to make sure my application starts with no problems before we start building out anything. And this will give us a good chance to kind of talk through some of this stuff too. Okay, so our application started, but let's jump back and talk through this. So the console is really good for logging out information and giving us information about what is going on here. So we can just see that it starts our application. It starts working on starting the application. The Tomcat service was started. It sets up some filters. We can see that Hibernate is now getting involved. So Hibernate's it started. We can see what dialect it's using. So if you've ever worked with Hibernate before, we can see that our Hibernate dialect is H2 dialect. We can import, execute the import script. Then we get some of these mapped. So it says mapped/error to this, mapped health to this. So by default, we get an error handler, and it sets up some maps for things like WebJars and our favicon, etc. But then because we checked that actuator, we also get some other mappings here. So you can see like /health, /beans, /info. And so that actuator starter gave us a whole bunch of really cool checks about our application. So we can really start to dig into our application and find out some info about it. So let's do this. Before we do anything, let's just go to our application. And we're going to refresh it. And so we're going to get an error. So all this is telling me is the first time you do this, the first time you start up boot, you're going to have this issue because we haven't actually set up any mappings yet. There's no mapping for anything. So that's why you get the error. But now if we wanted to, we can also go into those different checks. So we have a health check. And one of the things it tells us is status. So it's up. Here's our disk space. Here's our DB. Our DB looks fine. What are some other ones here? I think beans we want to look at. So beans tell us all the different beans that Spring is managing for us. So if you need to find out information about a specific bean and see how it was configured, you can get that report here. And so there's just a bunch of them. And I'm not going to go through every single one today, but these are some really cool metrics and health checks that we can get right out of the box just by using that actuator. So I'm going to go ahead and let's go ahead and stop this. So you may see some different examples that are a little bit older and have this main application file has like some more annotations here. So you used to have to use 3 different annotations, but now because of the way that we can just compose annotations in Spring, it's just one Spring Boot application. And it actually consists of a few. And so what it does is basically say that this is a Spring Boot configuration file. So it's a configuration file. We can go ahead and pick up beans from this file. We enable auto configuration. So auto configuration is a lot of the pretty cool magic that happens. If something is on the class path, it's going to go ahead and configure it for us. And then we component scan. So by default, whatever this package is in, so this package is com.thereal.vega, we're going to do a component scan lookup on that particular package and any sub packages. And that's how we find our different components like our controllers, services, etc. If you want to create a different package, so com.hello world, then we need to make sure that we include that in the component scan. And you can do that from here. It's pretty easy to do. So that is our main application file. So this is our file that we're going to run when we run our application. And now what I want to do is just start to build this app out. So what I like to do is come in here and kind of set up how I'm going to build this app. So I need a new package in here. I'm going to have controllers. I like to kind of clean everything up and put everything into packages. It just makes it easier for me to find stuff. So I know I'm going to need a domain. I know I'm going to need a service. And I know I'm going to need a repository. You would probably have some config too. In this particular demo, we're not going to do any configuration from that standpoint, but we would probably need that as well. So let's go ahead and start here. The first thing I want to do is come into our resources. So in our resources folder, we have this application.properties. And this is where we can start to configure our application. So whether we need to set our own configuration or override some other configuration that is already exists, this is where we're going to do it. You can also use an application.yaml file as well. And actually, if you use them both, they can both coexist. I think the properties overrides the YAML, and they kind of get merged together. But I'm just going to use the application.properties file because it's here. And what I want to do is come in and set a few things. And the nice thing about IntelliJ here is I get some code assist on this. So if I can't remember what exactly the property was to to change like the H2 console path, I can just start typing H2 and it's going to give me some code assist here. So I can see that by default, the H2 console path is H2-console. And I'm actually going to just change that. I like having it at console. I'm a weirdo. And then by default, the console is not enabled. So I actually want to enable this. And I'm also going to set something else here, the data source that, oh, come on. What is that? Platform is equal to H2. Okay, so let's go ahead and fire this back up. And I just want to show you from a data standpoint, we can go ahead and look in our database here, our H2 embedded database, by using this console. All right, so there's our console. The default JDBC URL is always going to be JDBC H2 mem testdb. If you rename that data source name in your application.properties, then this particular URL would change to whatever name that your DB is. So by default, it's testdb. I'm just going to stick with that. So we're going to connect to it. And we can see that we have nothing in here because we have no domain objects. We have no entities yet. And that's probably the next thing we need to do is go ahead and set up some entities. But actually, I want to start with the controller. So now that we know our database is kind of up, we can connect to it. Let's go ahead and start to build this out. So the first thing I'm going to need is a controller. I'm going to go in here and go new Java class. And I'm going to create a to-do controller. And that's a class. And all we need to do is create a new REST controller. So as I start typing, you're going to see I'm going to get some code assist here. I'm going to hit enter. This is a REST controller. I also want to, we'll come back to that actually. So let's just say that I'm going to create a method here called home that's going to return the words hello. All right, and all we're going to do is set up a request mapping for this. Go to that. So let's go ahead and rerun this. So there's this DevTools thing. I'm just going to mention it. I'm not going to actually use it, but there's this DevTools thing that you can include as a dependency that actually helps you with server restarts. So basically, anytime you make a change, it just kind of bounces for you. It's pretty helpful. I'm just not using it right now. So now, if we go back to localhost 8080, we should have something at our root and not an error. So basically, boom, we're getting some data back. So we got a string back, and it's really of type JSON. Well, actually, yeah, by default, we should be getting JSON back. So that was our main controller method, just being able to create a simple controller method. But I'm going to take this a little bit further. So we're going to actually make this work. So let's go ahead and let's put a request mapping of /todo on top of this to-do controller. So we have a top level request mapping, and then on every single individual method, we'll have its own mapping. So let's say that we want to get a iterable list of to-dos, and we'll call this list. And let's yeah, so at this point, I'm going to back up. We need to start building this out. So I'm going to create a new domain object. I'm going to create a new domain, and we're going to call this to-do. And just so you don't have to sit here and watch me type, I'm going to go ahead and pop some code in here, and let's talk about it. So this is going to be our representation of our to-do object. And the to-do is really simple in this case. I wanted to keep it simple. We have an ID, which is going to be the ID and the generated value. It's going to use @generated_value to create its ID. And this is of type long. We're going to have a string. We're just going to have a title of what our to-do is. And then we're just going to have a Boolean. Was it called completed? Did we complete this to-do task or not? For JPA, we actually need a private to-do constructor that takes no args. So that's what this is doing here. We're going to mark this class as an entity. Again, this is Spring Data. So if you have a chance, go in and check out Spring Data. And we would normally need some getters and setters here. And you can go ahead and generate those right in your IDE if you wanted to. But I just don't like doing that. I'm not a big fan of it. It's a waste of time for me. I'm using Project Lombok here and the @data annotation. And what that does is it generates those for me. So if I look at the structure of my data class now, I have a get ID, I have a get title, get completed, set. I get an equals and hash code and a toString all rolled up into one just from that one @data annotation. And if you've ever used Groovy, that's one of the reasons I love Groovy is it just makes things simple. And that's one of the things it does very well. So now we have our data class. And we need a way to access our data class. So the way that we're going to do that is actually by using a repository. And this is of type interface. Let's call this a to-do repository. So I'll explain this in a second. Okay, so this is part of Spring Data. Again, we don't have time to completely walk through Spring Data in this, but this interface, this is our repository, and this gives us some really good functionality right out of the box. So if we look at this CRUD repository, we have methods in here like save, save again, find one if we just want to find one specific item. Does it exist? Find all to get a list of them. Count, delete, etc. So we get some CRUD operations right out of the box, but we can also do some other things. So we're not actually going to use these today, but if we wanted to, we can go ahead and start to create our own methods in here too. So if I knew that I wanted to return a to-do and I wanted to find one by its title, I could. So just creating that method there gives us that ability to find something by a title. Say we wanted a list of to-dos, and we knew that we wanted the list of to-dos. Let's get that import. And we wanted to find by completed false. So we can do that too. So we can say, hey, just give me all the lists where completed is false, because maybe we wanted to display to-dos that we actually had to finish. So this to-do repository is really cool. It gives us all that power. And now we can start to build this out. So now what I need is a service layer. So if I come in here and go new Java class, and we'll call this a to-do service. And I'm going to go ahead and, to save some time, copy this as well. And let's just talk about what's going on here. So we have our to-do service. We've actually marked it with the @service annotation so that it does get marked as a Spring component and is picked up. And then inside of here, we've created a field here called to-do repository. And we're just inserting, getting an access to this to-do repository by dependency injection. So in the past, we might have had to say @autowired here. We don't actually need to do that anymore, because in the newest release of Boot and Spring Framework, if there's only one constructor here, it automatically gets the dependencies automatically managed for us. So that's pretty cool. So that gets inserted for us. And then we just have a bunch of methods here, right? List, get, save, update, delete. And this allows us to go ahead and call those repository methods. If we wanted to call another service method, say find by title, we could do so. Some people like to call the repository directly from their controller. I'm not one of them. I've just always used a service layer in MVC frameworks, from 10 years ago. So I always use a service layer, even though we're looking at this and all this service layer does is calling the repository, we might be doing other things here, right? Like we might have a method to email me when to-dos are completed. So that would be something that goes in here too. I just like using the service layer and not calling the repository directly, but I guess that's probably a preference thing. So now we have our service layer. Now we need to just build out our controller, right? So let's go ahead and I'm gonna just copy this too, just so we can save some time. And let's just go ahead and talk about this. So at the same time, I've created a to-do service here. So now we've wired in our to-do service. So now we can call the methods on our to-do service. So we have a request mapping of /list. So when we do that, we're going to call the to-do service list method, which basically brings us back a list of to-dos. We have a request mapping, and by default, these are gets. Spring, I think it's 4.3, which is part of Spring Boot 1.4, has some new attributes or annotations. So you can do something like get mapping or post mapping or put mapping. And those are pretty cool. I'm just going to stick with the request mappings for now, but just know that those are available. Then we have a request mapping of /view/ID. So this allows us to, the curly braces here kind of tell me that this is a path variable. So when we say view/1, that path variable is getting put into this long of ID. So that's how we get the correct data type conversion and pass that ID over to our service. You see we have a couple more things here. On this time, by default, these were all get methods. But when we create something, this is actually a post method, right? So on the create method, I'm using the value of /create, and that's going to be how we're going to get to it. And it's of type post. So if you call get on this method, it's not going to work. The to-do create method takes a request body to-do. So it takes some JSON data and it uses that to wire up a to-do object. And then we just have an update and a delete method. So these are basic CRUD operations of building out a REST API. And you'll notice here that there's not a lot going on here in our controller, which you should try to stick to. There shouldn't be a lot of noise in your controller. This should be pretty slimmed down. You want to offload a lot of your work to your services and repositories. So let's go ahead and fire this back up. And we're just going to do a couple things here and hopefully close this up. Oops. Yep, I know why. Let's just get rid of these. I'm not using these for now anyway. Okay, so our application started. Let's go ahead and bring that back up. Now if we go to localhost 8080, there's nothing there, but now we have a /to-do/list, and we actually have no data in here. So let's actually run through that real quick too. I'm going to create, there's actually a bunch of different ways that we can get data into this application. We could manually go into the database right now and run some insert statements. We could use our main application file to create like a command line runner to go ahead and insert some data. But you can also just come in here and create a data file. So I'm going to create a file that is data.h2. So h2 is the type of database I'm using here. So data.h2, we're just going to insert some data. And like I said, there's a couple different ways that we can do this. Just don't have time to get into every single one. If you do have questions on that, though, let me know. So we're just using a SQL file that's going to get picked up based on its name and its location. You can also use a schema file if you wanted to write the schema yourself. But that's going to go ahead and insert some data. So let's run this again. And we should have some data in here now. So now we have 3 objects. We have an ID of 1, 2, and 3. Here's the title and if it was completed or not. So that gives us some data. I'm going to actually go over to Postman now and test this out as well. So let's say we run that same get. Here's our data. how about a post? Let's go ahead and create a new one. Yep. So this should go ahead and create a new one, and we call in that create method. So to do /create, it's of type post. Here's the data that we're passing in. Obviously, in a regular application, you'll want to do some validation, and you can do so pretty easily. Validate it before you go ahead and try to save it out. So now we got 4. I have a put operation here now. So if we jump back to our app, and in our controller, you can see that we had a request method of put for our updates. It's pretty standard. So we're going to use a put, and all we're doing is changing this to say that this particular task was completed. So let's go ahead and send that. That looks good. If we run a get again, we should see that we have 4, and we do have 1 that is completed. So I'm just using a Postman, just a client here, to send requests back and forth, just to kind of test that service out. I think that's all I wanted to show. Obviously, one other thing I wanted to mention here is we do have our stub for our tests. If we wanted to, we can go ahead and run this. This is using JUnit out of the box. Again, I was not a big fan of some of the things you had to do for testing in Spring before version 1.4, and now they've just made it so much easier. And I hope to have some videos on that coming out pretty soon. You can see how our test ran past, but obviously we're not doing anything here. But there are some really great improvements in 1.4. Hopefully I'll have a video out soon on how to do that. So with that, I think I'm going to go ahead and see if we have any questions. I'm going to get back to this. I just wanted to let you know, like I said before, I do have Udemy courses on Spring Boot. There's a free course and a Spring Boot intro. You can get that for $20 today by using the code webinar20. And that right now has over 1,000 students paid, and I've got a whole bunch of really good reviews on it. So I'd also love your feedback. Go ahead and check it out and let me know what you think. And then I'll just see if there's any time for questions here. See if we have any questions. I don't see any coming in. Okay, so what I'm going to do is actually put a blog post together right after this, and we will just I'll just kind of outline where you can find this code. And obviously, if you need to email me, you can email me danvega@gmail.com, and just let me know what you think. I'd love some feedback on this presentation and anything that you saw today. And if you have some questions and we weren't able to get to them, just please go ahead and send them over to me, and I'd love to answer them for you. So thanks for coming. I appreciate your time, and I hope you guys learned something today. Thanks a lot.